Now we have, final piece of evidence for this is the first apology of Justin Martyr. He was born in 100 AD and died in 165. Okay, you go to the first apology of Justin, and you go to chapter 67, and it says this: "And on the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. Then when the reader has ceased, the president verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things. Then we all rise together and pray, and, as we said, when our prayers ended, bread and wine and water are brought, and the president in like manner offers prayers and thanksgiving, according to his ability, and the people assent, saying, Amen. There is distribution to each, and a participation of that over which thanks have been given, and to those who are absent a portion is sent by the deacons." Okay, so... Alright, so hopefully we've made the point. In the ancient world, there were too many copies for somebody to change them all. There were way more copies than what we have remaining or extant that still exist, because they rot. And most of the ones that we find come from Egypt, because the sands of Egypt, in fact, a lot of them are just in big old trash piles. Like Oxyrhynchus is where so many were found. It's just a big trash pile outside of town, and they've just found documents. The first one that somebody found there, the guy saw something in the ground and just kicked it, and it turned out to be P1. So, like, here's the thing. Okay, Ben, I agree. You probably agree with me that, like, nobody can change them all. But everybody could change theirs. So how do we know, how do we reconstruct what the original said? Well, if everybody's changing theirs, there's basic rules of textual criticism, and one of those rules is identity of manuscript entails identity of origin. That the manuscripts are not, since nobody can change them all, remember that, nobody can change them all. There's too many. Then, like, where they agree, that's what the original said, or what what they're copied from says. That becomes important for more than one reason. First of all, it means that we can group these manuscripts into families, in like family trees, and work back, because this one's copied, 5 copies are made from this one, and then 5 copies are made from each of those, and then 5 copies are made from each of those. It becomes this big family tree, and we can group them into family trees, because when somebody makes a mistake, if someone who makes the exact same mistake copied the mistake, okay, that's what's most likely. And so, you want to be a rational person, you want to believe what's most likely, what's highly probable. And if you want to be an irrational person, then you believe what's highly improbable. Okay, so anyway, the point for us is so simple. Like, our ancient manuscripts, like I've said, it's something like 99% consistency. Like, for the most part, they agree. For the most part, we're able to, are there discrepancies, variations between our manuscripts? Yes. Are there a lot of them? Well, in 1700, this guy made everyone go crazy when he said he's found 30,000. We have something like 40 times that today. So yeah, there's a lot of discrepancies. But most of these are simple goofs and spelling errors and, the ancient equivalent of typos. You forget to copy a sentence, you skip a sentence by accident, you copy the same sentence twice, you misspell a word, you leave a word out by accident. So the thing about mistakes like that is they're not a problem. It's obvious that a mistake was made, because mistakes, when someone makes a mistake, the text doesn't make sense. And so it's not a problem. You can reconstruct that. You can say, oh, you left this word out, that's not a problem. So where we have agreement is pretty strong. So But when someone intentionally changes the text, that can be an issue because it doesn't read like a typo. It actually makes sense. So that's the issue. But like, if you've got a modern study Bible, it's going to say for you at down in the footnotes, like, some manuscripts read so and so to so and so so and so, and like, that's fine. Like, for me personally, my grandparents gave me a Bible in Christmas 2000 that was a study Bible, and it had all this stuff. It was an NIV study Bible, and it, like, I've just kind of came up being accustomed to, like, on this verse right here, some manuscripts read that. So I guess we're not 100% certain whether it should say this or that, because there's discrepancies over this. Some manuscripts read it differently, have a different word here, or some manuscripts like leave this out. And like, what they do is, these textual critics debate this. They make an argument for, like, having this in there or having this out. But like, all of this is super familiar to you if you just got a modern study Bible and you look at those footnotes and you're like in Luke, that part where Jesus is praying in the garden and the angel comes to comfort him, that's not in all the manuscripts. So maybe we don't know if it was in the original. You can make an argument for it was, and you can make an argument that it wasn't. But they're not conclusive. So like, what you look at are things that were being debated. It seems that there were more changes being made before 300 AD. And after 300 AD, when there's money into it, you start to get in these professional scribes who seem to do a better job. But that earlier period, where it's just whoever in the church, had the time and the energy to make a copy, there seems to be more changes being made. So like, if we know historically what the arguments and the debates and the doctrinal and theological battles that were going on in that era, then we can start to say, like, okay, this change supports this view, or this change supports that view. And it's important to understand, everybody agrees with this on both sides, that no major doctrine is threatened by any of these. And it's sort of obvious if you've got a modern study Bible and you look at those footnotes. It's not really a difficult question. But like, it seems what they were doing was, sometimes they intentionally would make a change because they thought the previous guy goofed. And then but he didn't goof, like they mistakenly, so it's both intentional and accidental in a sense. Sometimes it seems like they were trying to make their doctrine more obvious. So like, the problem a lot of times is that, like, Mark, for example, the way he writes stuff requires you to study what he has to say and think really hard about it. Or like, for example, Jesus says, no one knows, when the end of time will come. Not the angels and not even the Son, only the Father knows. Okay, that fits real well with, like, the adoptionists, the Ebionites. And so there were some manuscripts that changed that. I forget what the change is, but you can look it up in your study Bible. And it seems like they changed it so that, like, again, the Bible does affirm that, like, Jesus really is more than a human, really is God. But you have to, again, it's just in Matthew. But like, you have to, what they're doing is trying to make it more obvious. And that's most of what they seem to be doing, is like making it harder for people to wiggle out of what they have to say. But again, the issue is, these early Orthodox Christians, like Bart Ehrman calls them proto-Orthodox. Well, that just means proto-correct opinion. So they were the ones who had it right. Given what we know, they're the ones who were correctly passing on to us. So like what the apostle says. So like, the thing is, the New Testament documents, when you interpret the Bible, what you want to do is follow basic rules where you never want to hang your doctrine, your view, your theology, your teaching on one verse or like one word in one verse. Basic rules of interpretation they should teach you at your church, and they should teach you at your seminary, is like, let the Bible interpret the Bible. When you've got a passage, you want to correlate it with other passages to look for what the consistent teaching across Scripture is. And what's best is if you can find another text written by the same author that will help you clarify an unclear text. And then what's really best is if you can find another verse or passage in the exact same book of the Bible. A lot of times when an author says something that could be misunderstood, he'll like clarify it with like saying more about it. And so that's what you want to do. And if you're hanging things on just one word, you want to be careful with that, just in general. Because there's also a question of interpretation and translation, which is a whole other question. English language, English didn't exist back then. You're reading the NIV, but like the original wasn't in English because there was no English. It's in Greek. Okay, so all of our oldest manuscripts are in Greek, and we think that it might be that Mark, there is some ancient historical evidence, like these other translations, we have the story of people talking about the work of translating them, of the Bible from Greek, but like there is an ancient source that tells us that Mark was actually Peter's scribe, and he translated Peter's Aramaic into Greek for him. So you have, we don't know if that's true, but like, anyway, what we do, like we can make a case for it, but I'm not familiar enough with this stuff to make the case myself. So I have to punt to the historians, but like a good case can be made. So anyway, that being said, we know what the original said, and we don't know what the original said. So, I saw an atheist guy online, and he said, like, Paul never claimed to see the risen Jesus. And it was like, yeah, he did. He claimed in Galatians 2 that he received a direct revelation from Jesus. And he claimed it in 1 Corinthians 15. Like, what are you talking about? He said the guy on the atheist online said Paul just received his message from the Peter and the apostles, and it's like, what are you talking about? That's not what Paul said in Galatians. So like, hopefully we've made the point at this point, and this is gonna be a long video because we're at an hour and a half in, but we'll just cut it up as much as we need to. But the concept's really simple. I just wanted to belabor it at length. But once you get through this, it's like, okay, I get it. It's not too complicated. And you can explain to someone a lot more quickly. So I wrote some stuff to kind of go through this. But basically, the question is not whether anyone changed all the text to push an agenda. That was impossible. Some of them were changed here and there. The copying appears to have been done with a church with little money. Mistakes were most likely to be made, and the texts bear witness to this. Intentional changes were likely to be made too, and the text bears witness to that. The question is whether we can reconstruct the original based on what we have. And the starting point is not merely Vaticanus or Sinaiticus. Rather, it's all the available data. The earlier manuscripts are an obvious source, but later manuscripts are as well, because the later manuscripts do not all simply stem from like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. No. These family trees exist, and we're able to reconstruct and tell that like the later manuscripts, even those medieval ones that date, after 1000 AD, they go back to manuscripts that are lost to us. So like, it's not just a matter of looking at the oldest ones and then the later ones are made from the oldest ones. Most of the oldest ones are gone, but the later ones they were made at a time when they had access to earlier ones, or other earlier ones that were gone in between. So like, there's different family trees. There's like, we've lost some of the earlier ancestors in the family trees. So like, we can actually cross-reference the later ones for accuracy, and you get this like. If once you remove the obvious, easy to spot errors, then you get like 99% or something like that. Okay, so there's some stuff in there that was changed, and we're going to talk about some of that. But like, all right. So anyway, the question about whether or not we can reconstruct the original boils down to how much detail are you asking that? How, yes, we can, but not in 100% detail. Like if let's say that we tried to use the ancient translations, the 10,000, actually 18, I think we have 10,000 translations in the Syriac, Coptic, and Latin. Their manuscripts are much later than the Greek, and if we tried to use those to reconstruct the Greek, the problem is we would have to reverse translate. And the problem is many times in translations there's multiple ways to translate something that would be accurate. So like, we can't reconstruct the Greek from that either, So it's difficult to use only the Greek manuscripts to go back to the original with 100% precision, but for the most part, we're pretty close. Now, we do have ancient Christians like Tertullian, like Irenaeus, like Justin Martyr, these guys quote the Bible heavily, and we can, generally, they quote the entire New Testament. I mean, who knows exactly how many, but basically, yeah, they quote the whole New Testament, almost the whole Bible, I think, like minus 11 verses I've heard, but like the whole New Testament, yeah, they quote it. Can we do a reconstruction based on them? Well, yes and no. The problem is they just quote. There were no verse and chapter references back then. They just quote something from Luke. We don't know where in Luke that would go. If we didn't have the ancient manuscripts of the Bible to tell us where to put those quotations, then we couldn't really reconstruct the Bible just from these early Christians who quoted it. We can't do that. But like, because we wouldn't know how to. These are valuable because they give us the words as they existed in that guy's time. But like, we can't just reconstruct it that way. Okay, now there's 3 biggies that like got in all the Bibles. 3 big changes. How do they get in all of them? Okay, so I forget what chapter it is. I think it's John 7. You have this woman caught in adultery, and they're going to stone her. And Jesus says, "Let who is without sin among you cast the first stone." Okay? So, like, this isn't in the Greek manuscripts until around 1000 AD it shows up. Problem. Okay, there's more of a story about that. So like, we have writings from Jerome and also Augustine around 400 AD, and Jerome's making this Latin translation, and they're both complaining that it's in some copies of the Bible but not all. They seem to think that like people got rid of it because it was too lenient on sin. But for as far as what we have, we only have one manuscript, which is Codex Bezae, which dates to around 425, maybe 450. And so it just doesn't show up until the 900s. So like, how did that get in all the Bibles? Well, it like never did. We have one. The issue seems to just never not be brought up. We have one text that mentions it at that time as not being in most manuscripts and not mentioned by many church fathers. But slowly it makes its way into more and more manuscripts. So this is important. Just because the majority of the manuscripts say something, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct. It's only correct when you have like 100%, It's one explanation people think might be possible today is that this story is called the adultery pericope or something, is something that John taught that got added in by certain people because John did teach it, but he didn't write it in John. That's one possible explanation. But really, this serves as a case example of the difficulties of changing the text. We have writings from Jerome and Augustine who tell us it's not in all the text in their day, and it's not in all the text that we have. And we have copies from back then, and it's not in them. Like for example, this copy of John, P66, not in P66. It dates to about 200 AD. So like, it's a discrepancy. Like, and there seems to be a story of like, we're not sure exactly how it got in there, but like, anyway, it never got in all of them, and we know that it didn't get in all of them. But like, so anyway, I don't know, like, did it eventually make it into all the later manuscripts? I don't think so, but I couldn't find anyone online talking about that, other than, like, it's just well known that it just kind of shows up around 900, 1000 AD, and it becomes popular and makes it into more and more. But the problem really is that it was, and the same thing can be said about this, like, there's a longer ending of Mark, and your modern study Bible will say this isn't in the oldest and best manuscripts. So the consensus today is that like these passages shouldn't be in there, but like I think they did a fascinating thing with Vaticanus where they were able to look back through and see that it originally wasn't in there, and it originally just said according to Mark at the end, and then like somebody went back and erased that and wrote back over on Vaticanus. That's incredible if that's true. I remember seeing something about that, but it's not important for us to know right now. But like, it just we can plot the process of how it got into manuscripts. The thing is, when Jerome made his Latin translation, that became the basis for a whole lot of things, and it makes it into all these Latin ones, and so then people don't want it. They want it. People who are accustomed to reading the Latin translation became so dominant in Western Europe that people considered that the real Bible, and they didn't like the Greek Bible. They thought the Greek Bible was corrupted. And also in the East, they had Byzantine ones, which are around Greece, and they had Alexandrian ones. I don't think it made it into all of those either. Because they weren't influenced by the Latin Bible, and it made it into the Latin Bible. And then the other big thing that we don't know where it comes from, but it's called the Johannine comma. In the Gospel of John, I think in 1 John, in the 5th chapter, you get this thing called the Johannine comma, which is this like super explicit explanation of the Trinity, of the doctrine of the Trinity, that apparently Jerome put. It's not in any of the Greek manuscripts, but it's in the Vulgate. It's in Jerome's Vulgate. Apparently Jerome put it in there, and the doctrine of the Trinity is taught in Scripture, but you have to study. It's not super obvious, but like the Johannine comma is this thing that like is like super obvious. So. Like this is the way it happened. This is like the story of the study of textual criticism really is the story of the New Testament, and textual criticism of the New Testament gave birth to textual criticism in general. And so, like in the 1500s, you have this guy named Erasmus, and he's rushing to get the first ever printed edition of the New Testament in Greek out. And there's some other people working on like a polyglot version, which had like the Latin and the Greek, and then I think one other one, and the Latin was in the middle because they thought that was the better one. And so Erasmus, like in just a few months, does this hurried printed edition of the New Testament, and he goes to I believe it's Basel, Switzerland, and gets a small handful of copies. Some people think he only had 3. He doesn't have Revelation, so he borrows that from a friend. And then there's the manuscript of Revelation that he has from his friend is like missing some, so he reverse translates that out of the Latin. And it creates this version of that portion of Revelation that never existed before. Because it's different. It has all these discrepancies. And you have to trace back to like, oh, that's Erasmus's reverse translation. And it doesn't have this, but it doesn't have this Johannine comma in it. And he had to get permission from the Pope to print this. But it doesn't have this Johannine comma. And so like... everybody criticizes and says, he's bad, and it's bad, and this is, what a terrible thing that he's putting out. So, he says, if you can find me one Greek manuscript that has the Johannine comma in it, I'll put it in my printed edition. And so what they did was they just made a manuscript and put it in there and reverse translated from the Latin. And then all of his Erasmus's later ones have it. Well, the thing is, because of the printing press becoming such a big deal, Erasmus's printed edition of the New Testament, or editions, I think he went up to 5 or something, that just became the New Testament to everybody who was doing translations. And that just became the standard version. People thought there were no discrepancies because it's just Erasmus, and that's it. That's the printed edition of the Bible, and they all say the same thing. And it came to be called the Textus Receptus, or received text. And it wasn't until the 1700s where a guy by the last name of Mill put out an edition that footnoted 30,000 discrepancies between the manuscripts. And like people went bananas. But like the thing is, before that happened in 1611, the King James Bible was translated from just using Erasmus's printed edition, which was based on maybe only 3 Greek manuscripts and this weird thing that he was like forced into doing with this fake one that they made for him. And so the King James has the Johannine comma, and like the King James became so dominant in the English language because it was the first Bible in the English language that was widespread and read. I mean, people were making them before, but it was like illegal. And all of a sudden, this is the King's Bible. So like everybody read it, and it became so prevalent that it influenced the English language itself. Like how we speak, it had a profound influence on the language itself. So like it just was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. So the point is, that's how certain these, when Jerome translates into Latin and he puts certain things in his Latin translation is really popular, and so it gets in all these Latin ones. And then, like Erasmus's printed edition is popular because of the printing press. And so there's these like bottleneck points where certain changes can become, widespread and get into everything that's based on those. But you never got into all the manuscripts. None of these changes got into all the manuscripts. Let's look it up. I don't think they do. The adulterated pericope. We're never. No one wants to talk about it. You know what I mean? Like, I don't. From what I've heard is so we have the quotations from the early church. The church fathers, these Christians who wrote, it was unknown to them. Like it's just not in their quotations, so that's a problem for it. So yeah, like it shows up so late that we have lots of copies. But I don't think it ever got into all of them. Okay, so I don't know. From what I've heard, the Alexandrian manuscripts are considered the most reliable, although they don't always trump other ones. And the point there is that, like, given that, it's probably not in there. Okay. Um, so I'll just say based on that, but I couldn't find any source for like how many manuscripts it made it into. But it's just well known that it shouldn't be in all of them. So anyway, those are three biggies. So now we need to move to the question of forgery. I've been going for an hour and 54 minutes, but this actually shouldn't take that long because I just wrote it out. I just got to read it. All right, so off the bat, certain letters that claim to be authored by Paul are undisputed by all scholars on all sides, and that's all I've said so far in these apologetics videos. Is like, you know, 1 Corinthians, Romans, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, Philemon, and Galatians are undisputed. Paul wrote those. The rest are disputed, though. So this means that critical scholars reject them and Christian scholars accept them. Okay? The list is Ephesians, or sometimes people who are critical scholars like to be called Christians, so that's a little bit confusing. But I don't know. A lot of Christian scholars who they get offended by saying that they're not critical and they don't make judgments. Anyway, the list of rejected letters is Ephesians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Timothy, and Titus. The critical historians are divided over Colossians. It's in and it's out. It's up and it's down. It's left and it's right. Okay.